It's about how you get that physical experience onto the page in order that the reader can feel that they're walking in the shoes of your character or your narrator. It's really fundamental to writing. So the way that I teach is I do a lot of exercises in nature to help people to make contact with a great kind of breadth and depth of experience, of movements, of sounds, of smells, of tastes, with the idea that this then informs people's writing and strengthens people's writing. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I work with writers of fiction and non-fiction, and experienced writers and novice writers, the whole range really. It seems to me that these tools are very useful whatever kind of writing you do. So maybe I better just define what I mean by wild first, because I sort of bandy around the word wild, and obviously wild is quite a subjective word. It means lots of different things to different people. But when I say wild, I mean vivid and alive and instinctual, and very much in tune with the environment as well, and very much in equilibrium with the environment. So sometimes people hear the word wild and they get a bit nervous about it because it feels like it means crazy, or kind of crazy or nuts or mad or some of those things. And actually it's not really like that, because if you think about how a wild animal functions, a wild animal has to live very much in tune with this environment, not against it. So it's about functioning from a place where you come back to equilibrium as a writer, rather than going off and kind of allowing your words to rampage all over the shop. As we know, if you just kind of cathart, just kind of express everything, sometimes your novel can end up kind of 3 times as long as you expected it to be, or something like that. So writing isn't only about expression, is it? It's also about how we harness and how we contain our words as well. So it's all of that as well. And if you think about a wild animal in nature, in the wild, you think about the fact that it uses every part of itself in order to thrive, in order to survive. And it uses its senses, its sense of smell and taste and touch and sound. And it then feels certain sensations in its body as a result of that stimuli. And those can be pulsing, they can be heat, they can be cold, they can be contraction or expansion, they can be, all sorts of just pure physical sensations of movement, really. And from that, certain senses of movement, sensations of movement, will intensify into what we might call emotions. And so an animal obviously does not name emotions as such, but it certainly experiences feelings and intense sensations that cause it either to fight or to flee, or if it can't fight and it can't flee, it will go into a kind of a freeze response, won't it? Have you ever seen that in an animal? Where it goes into that kind of, that real sort of freezing response, because it has no way of escape. But if you watch an animal go into a freeze response, you'll see that naturally, once the threat has passed, the animal will come out of it and it will be perfectly okay again. And what I work with a lot with writers is the fact that writers, and human beings in fact, we have a tendency to go into also the same kind of animalistic freeze response, but very often we don't know how to get out of it and we get stuck in it. And writer's block, I think, would be a classic example of how that happens, really. That sense of sitting down at the blank page and just freezing, or getting to a certain plot point and finding that you can't shift yourself from it. So it's really interesting to look at why it is that animals in nature know how to come out of that back into a healthy way of functioning, and why human beings aren't very good at it. And there's a whole kind of psychotherapeutic philosophy around that. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it equates very much with writers and writer's block. And so an animal uses all of the parts of itself to function, and it also responds very well to threat, doesn't it, really? If you watch an animal, you'll see it kind of get activated as it comes up against a threat. So you'll see its eyes will get wider, its pulse will speed up, the blood will leave its core and go out to its limbs so that it's ready to run in some direction or another. So the whole organism will speed up, and all this great amount of energy it will be tied up in the organism at this point. And then it will respond effectively to the threat, won't it? So it will fight, or it will flee, or it will freeze and come back to equilibrium after that. So whatever it does is a very proactive response. It's an action, isn't it? It's a movement. There's nothing kind of frozen about it. And it's interesting that if you look at the kind of the arc of energy of an animal, you'll see it's very much like a narrative arc, that it rises to this peak of the energy all being bound up, and then the energy is released. And if you think about how a writer might function, I think a writer who I would consider a wild writer would function something the same. So a wild writer, for example, would be sitting, imagine you've saved half an hour of your day in which to do your novel that you've been planning to do for months, and lots of us know that feeling, and this is your really, really precious time. And then you get a phone call, you just sat down and you get a phone call, okay? So a healthy response to the phone call would be to make a very clear decision, wouldn't it? Either I answer the phone and deal with it, or I leave the phone and continue writing and ignore it, okay? But what so often happens is that instead of doing that, we get caught in this kind of, oh, shall I answer it, shall I not? What if it's my mother, she's going to say she's ill and then I have to go and see her and that wrecks my writing time. And we get caught in these huge loops, don't we, all the time, these huge thinking loops. And that generally is what seems to keep us in a kind of a helpless, frozen state in terms, so it's to do with the way we use our minds, And as wild writers, what I try to help people with, firstly, is a feeling that they can make conscious choices and move in situations of fear. They can move towards that fear, and they can make conscious choices, which will then help to get them out of those loops. So that's the kind of the basis of it, really. And I have an absolute firm belief that we are all natural storytellers. If you look at how human beings function, storytelling is absolutely vital to how we survive. We tell stories all the time in all sorts of ways, and we do it, it's thought now that we largely do it in order to practice how to overcome problems. So they've done some studies recently about dreaming, and they found that although if you ask people tend to say, 50% of my dreams are just nice and relaxed, for example. When they do studies, they find that 80% of dreams are about having a problem and solving it. So there's a kind of general consensus now that storytelling is a vital process for us to learn to rehearse how to deal with problems. In the same way, I don't know if you've ever seen animals often rehearse quite repetitive actions over and over again. You see sometimes a seagull, for instance, will drop a stick and catch it, and drop a stick and catch it. And so for all animals, including human beings, we have ways of rehearsing those things that help us survive. And I think it's no different with human beings and no different with writers. That, writing is really fundamental. It's not. We can have a tendency sometimes to think that it's a little added extra, a little luxury for our lives to be writers. But I don't believe that. I believe that it's really absolutely fundamental. So there's a level on which it's really great to have a sort of trust initially that we do know how to write, because we do. Human beings write. Human beings are writers. And I think if we can find that trust, it can help us sometimes in difficult times just to come back to this sense that we do know how to do it. We know how to do it. It's just that sometimes we get stuck in this kind of frozen, helpless place and in these loops, and we get stuck in that. But if we can remember to come back to a sense of trust and a sense of sort of our ability to make proactive choices and our ability to move towards fear, then we can come back into these kind of natural narrative arcs. So, what else did I want to say? That's quite a lot.
I'm jolly good at all of food.
No, I haven't written it down yet.
I go off a bit. It's a very rich subject and I love it, and it also ties in with things I won't go into now because there's too much, but things about metaphor and how we function metaphorically is also very interesting. But maybe, given that we're outside and it's a little bit chilly, maybe I'll set you off in an exercise, if that's all right, and we'll do a little bit of writing. So, yes, I use this metaphor all the time in my teaching about us as wild writers and our writing as wild words, as opposed to caged writers and caged words. And if you think of an animal in a cage, they can sometimes be. If you've seen an animal in a zoo in a terrible state or a circus, they've lost touch. They can't orient to their environment because they have no contact with it. Their senses diminish. They lose touch with their ability to face and deal with threats and their ability to face and deal with opportunities. And they often turn in on themselves and start to pull their fur out or kind of effectively self-harm in the way that human beings sometimes do as well. So what we're trying to do is trying to get away from that and back to a sense of functioning in a way that's healthy. And the metaphor of tracking a wild animal I also use quite a lot, because I think the process of learning to write well and live well, in fact, is quite similar to the process of tracking a wild animal. So it starts with that thing about using your senses, okay? So it starts with using our eyes and using our ears, using our sense of taste, our sense of smell, using our sense of touch. And this is the way that we begin to track the wild words, in fact, in the same way we track a wild animal. So what I'd like you to do, you have about 25 minutes, and I'll give you a 5-minute warning when you're close to the end. I'll shout as loudly as I can. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think of yourself as that wild writer, okay? And imagine that you're on the trail of your wild words. I'd like you just to find a space of your own, and I'd like you just to write something, a piece of prose or a piece of poetry that includes each of the senses, each of the 5 senses. So you want to, what do you smell? What do you hear? What do you see? What do you taste? What do you touch? Yeah? So I'd like you to include all of the senses. I'd also like you to include how you experience being there in your body. What happens to your body? And I don't mean emotions so much as movements. So contraction, expansion,
Goosebumps.
heat, cold, goosebumps. Maybe you're feeling chilly. Maybe you feel the wind in your hair. You see why I wanted to do this exercise outside. It's quite hard to do this. People kept saying to me, "Oh, you're inside. It's going to rain." And I was like, "Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure we can." So senses and also your experience of it in your body. And the third thing is just to also have an appreciation of your emotional response to where you are. So emotions that are that more kind of intense form of bodily sensations, really. So what's your emotional response, okay? Okay, so your 5 senses, bodily sensations and emotions, just in response to where you are outside this morning.